Chapter 2: The Forgiveness Experience. Release your resentments and open space for forgiveness. The Cosmic Game.
This is an experiential practice that I have received very positive feedback on. Many of the people who have practiced it said that they could relate easily to it. But what they found most of all was the significant impact that took place within them from practicing such a simple technique. One night I was lying in bed feeling very troubled. I used to wake up regularly at around 2:30 or 3:30 in the morning with my mind already working on the pressures of the coming day. Concerns about finances, projects, and time management were provoking anxiety. I would spend the rest of the night feeling overwhelmed. I told myself I needed to stop experiencing this. I wanted more peace. To understand why I would frequently wake up feeling troubled, I decided that I could simply stay with the anxiety and see what would happen. They say that human beings are not rational creatures but emotional ones. Every time my head started to rationalize why I would be feeling this way, I would try to release the mind chatter and remain with the feeling of dread. Suddenly, I heard this very clear voice inside my head saying, "You need to practice asking for forgiveness." I remember thinking, how can I do that? The voice replied, "You already know how to." I began trying to understand what at that moment had taken place. Suddenly, different pieces of information stored in my memory came together spontaneously like a jigsaw puzzle falling into place. There were 3 pieces of information that connected with one another. When I was working with my clients, we would focus at times on their emotions. We talked about negative emotions and how they would drain us. The common ones I used were anxiety, fear, helplessness, hopelessness, sadness, guilt, and worry. In our published research and spirituality programs that had been created and tested by our research team, people talked about how they felt forgiveness, compassion, and gratitude. This made them become more aware, energized, and hopeful. I also remembered a chart from Dr. Hawkins's book Power versus Force, which created a hierarchy of values for different emotions. By a sophisticated analytic process, different emotions were given certain values. Positive ones, such as forgiveness and gratitude, scored higher than negative ones, such as fear and anxiety. There was an identified neutral value that separated the positive from the negative. To live a more fulfilling life, it was important to be in emotional states above this neutrality point. Trapped in the lower or negative emotions disable the ability to create value or improvements for anyone. The next piece of information that fell into place came from my reading on brain plasticity. Researchers found that when someone was experiencing negative emotions such as anxiety and fear, their right frontal cortex would show greater activity. When they were experiencing gratitude, their left frontal cortex would become more active. The right and left frontal cortex is located behind the forehead. They are separated by a groove, and this provides the opportunity for the separate lobes to be studied. That was the second point. The third connection was again with brain plasticity. If someone were to be examined by a functional MRI and they were feeling emotional about an issue and were facing that person who was physically present, their MRI would give off certain signals. When they only imagined that the person was there and began expressing how they felt and why, the MRI would give off the identical patterns. As these fell into place, I suddenly realized that I needed to look for people who I should ask forgiveness of. There were many times in my life I wish I did some things differently. So here I was lying in bed and wondering where would be the best place to start with my forgiveness work. I suddenly thought about teenage and young adult romances. I am sure that this is a common experience for you as well. I did not have a lot of relationships during those years, but the relationships I had never seemed to end well. There were issues that were highly emotional, less rational, and had created guilt and remorse over the years. It seemed like a good place to start. I began to visualize the faces of those who I had some attachment to in a romantic way during that period. As their faces began to appear, I thought I would start with the one that I truly needed to ask forgiveness of. Suddenly, out of the blue, another face appeared. I was not expecting it. Technically, we had never had a relationship. Somehow it felt right, and so I visualized her face. Memories just began awakening within me. I used to attend my high school in the city and would take the train from my town to get there. When the train arrived at my station, it was usually full. It then became an express train and rolled on directly into the city. There was this young lady whom I was extremely attracted to. I remember staring through the window in the morning as we would pass her stop and try to get a glimpse of her. In the evenings, when I took the train out of the city back home, it would make all of the stops. Most often, she would come on the train and sit in the carriage that I was traveling in. I had the biggest crush on her, but felt very shy about saying anything. She never seemed to even be aware that I existed. I did not know if it was shyness or simply that I was not on her radar. On occasion, she would sit in the row where I was. Usually, the seats were facing each other. I remember on one occasion she was sitting opposite me, and a friend was chatting with the both of us. She would answer in monosyllables. At that time also, it was not expected that young ladies from the same cultural background I came from could be seen chatting freely with the opposite sex in a public place. Because she came from a family that appeared very strict, I understood that. I summed up my courage eventually and asked her if she would attend my high school graduation dance with me. Her answer was spontaneous. She indicated that her father would not allow her to do so. I remember feeling devastated. As you know, crushes in the teenage and young adult years can be very intense, as if the world would end if things fell apart. I never knew if she would have gone out with me if her father had allowed it. All this was happening as I was lying in bed. The story was flowing. To continue, sometime later, I heard that she was getting married and going abroad. A sudden flash came to me that emotionally I felt devastated, and for some reason, I had a strong sense of rejection from her. I felt as if she had abandoned me. I was never aware of ever feeling that previously. I realized that for over 40 years I had been holding that resentment. I suddenly understood that holding on to it was affecting both of us, but most of all, it was affecting the harmony of the universe. The divine harmony by itself is always peaceful and blissful. Just as in the quote from Narayani Amma, like drops of milk, when our emotions become negative, we actually pollute the divine harmony of the universe. This realization was quite intense and I felt very sad. While, though I did not know where she lived, I could still visualize her and the connection would be the same as if I was talking to her. I remember asking her to forgive me for holding on to this resentment for so many years. I was genuinely sorry. I was looking at her in her imaginary eyes and asking for forgiveness, as I had affected the harmony of the universe as well as hers and mine. Suddenly, some black ball of energy flew out of my chest. It was a remarkable experience. Because when I thought about her again and wanted to repeat the process, all I could feel was love and gratitude in relation to her. The resentment of over 40 years had disappeared. I then thought that this was an extremely interesting experience. I began to visualize the faces of other girlfriends. I would look into their eyes and ask them for forgiveness. Some of them I had to revisit night after night, as I would feel that there was still a need for me to ask forgiveness. I always knew when I had completely cleared my process with them. I would then feel love and gratitude instead of some negative experience such as guilt, shame, sadness, or any of the others. As I continued to practice this at night, as I could not be disturbed otherwise, suddenly very interesting things began happening. Faces began appearing. There was a young girl in my class when we were 5 years of age. I had never even thought of her over all the years. The issue was a group of us were playing at the break and she suddenly told them that I had asked to copy her homework. I remember at that time feeling very angry as it was untrue. Everybody knew that she would make up things like this, but when it was about me, I felt strongly offended. I had been carrying that resentment within my consciousness for so many years. I remember looking at her face and asking her for forgiveness for holding on to these resentments about her. It would not only cause disharmony for her, but I had affected the harmony of the divine universe by holding these negative resentments. I had added a drop of poison to the bucket of milk. I kept doing this, and when I would revisit anyone whom I had asked for forgiveness, those I now felt compassion and love for, I knew I had dealt with the issue. If it had not been fully dealt with, I would not feel this way and would keep revisiting it night after night until I felt that love. Suddenly, a whole storm of faces would appear at night. I had never realized how many little resentments I had been carrying all through my life. It was amazing. I used to tell my friends who were practicing this along with me that I could have filled a stadium of people I needed to ask forgiveness of. I remember one occasion a face appeared to me that I had at no time recollected. I had never thought that I would be associated with carrying an emotion like that. While I was at university, a friend of mine had a car, which obviously meant that he was an important person to all of us without our own means of transport. He and I went to drop his car off at the mechanic to get it serviced. During the bargaining for the cost of the service, my friend, as I now realized, was really being aggressive towards getting the cost significantly reduced. When this mechanic's face appeared to me, the story surrounding him also appeared. He needed the money to buy food for his family. As a result, he knew that the bargaining was unfair, but he agreed because he needed the money. The mechanic was making his decision out of fear. However, I realized that being a participant in that process, I had been carrying a significant amount of shame for being there and knowing what was taking place. I remember looking into his face and asking him to forgive me for that emotion that was causing disharmony to him and the universe. I was surprised because I had to revisit that situation for a while until I finally felt love and compassion. It was interesting for me because I had never even recognized that I was a strong participant in that process. When you practice this, you will find that sometimes small and trivial issues actually impacted you more than the other obvious ones. So every night faces began coming at me in large numbers. Little things like asking forgiveness of some of my friends for brief irritabilities that took place while we were at university. Whether I was jealous because some of them appeared to be more competent at seducing the opposite sex, or whether someone had come into my room and used some of my property. I was quite surprised because our group is still very close and loving. These unimportant irritants that would never even count in our very human role, I had been carrying hundreds or thousands of these minor irritants or resentments. I would ask for forgiveness over and over. As I did this, I would begin to feel lighter within me, particularly when I felt more love and gratitude and was releasing whatever emotional energy was stored within me. One night, a face suddenly appeared to me, and I could see, accompanying this face, a huge black pool of negative energy within me. I recognized that there was some significant emotional energy associated with this person. He was the stepson of my uncle who was living abroad. This young man had been a behavioral problem for them, and my uncle asked my parents if they would have him live with us for a year or two to see if things would change. This boy was about 10 or 11 at that time, and I was about 13 or 14. Most of the time, we all got along very well, but he had a violent temper. He would get out of control, and there were times where he would grab a knife and had to be restrained just in case he intended to stab someone. I never thought about it at that time that he was from another culture, spoke a different language, and was obviously feeling a strong sense of loss. Because he would become angry and rebellious, usually there were fights. I remember sometimes using more force than was necessary. As I began experiencing this again, I recognized that I had been carrying an inordinate sense of shame for my behavior. I had done things in anger, and I truly felt great shame and remorse. For many nights, I would visualize this face and ask him to forgive me for my behavior. Ultimately, I began to feel this love and compassion and gratitude around him. After he left our family, I lost contact with him. He returned home and reportedly continued to be such a problem to his mother, she had to place him possibly with his grandparents. She would not talk about him and would become very upset if we asked any questions as to what was happening with him. So he disappeared for so many years from all of us. A few weeks after my forgiveness work around him, my son contacted me and said he had been in a conversation with someone on Facebook. This person had recognized the surname and asked him if he was related to my brothers, sister, or me. When he indicated that he was my son, this man wrote back and said, "Tell my brothers and sister that I miss them and would love to contact them. Living with them at that time was the best years of my life." I remember tearing up and feeling this inordinate sense of love and connectedness with him. We are planning at some time to return to Trinidad and have him join us as well for a family reunion. It would be great to see him again. I continued to work on my forgiveness. At nights, when I woke up, I would ask, whom did I need to ask forgiveness of? Faces would appear randomly, and I was committed to doing the work. One night, I was asking who I should ask forgiveness of when suddenly divine consciousness appeared. It is difficult to describe the experience. I felt exquisite joy ranging to extreme sadness. I remember thinking, this is why people who practice Christianity ask God to have mercy on them, because of the intensity of the emotions. I remember spontaneously asking this divine consciousness to forgive me for having disrupted its harmony, and please have mercy on me. It was an extremely profound experience. Since then, I have noticed a change in me. Whenever I am relating to anyone, I not only recognize him or her as human beings, but there is a recognition that within them is a touch of the divine. It is more difficult to carry resentments and judgments because of this realization. I am very conscious that doing so, I am responsible for the disharmony or the drop of poison that I would inject into the bucket of milk. I felt lighter inside. It does not mean that all my problems have been solved, but I have a greater sense of faith and being able to manage even the direst circumstances. Now back to you. Every one of us has those experiences. Some of the people I have worked with about this technique have described the same type of experiences that I have had. One or two of them have even reached the stage where divinity has appeared to them. They all describe that sense of change within them and the profound experience of asking forgiveness. Their experience was the same as mine, and they were feeling similar to how I did while practicing this. I will tell you that as you practice this, you will have the same profound experiences. Now let us talk about the different ways some people have experienced it. Some have told me that when they were asking forgiveness of people that they felt extremely sad and depressed. Some of them gave up at that time. Others worked their way through it and recognized that through persistence they could break that barrier of feeling sad. Other people would tend to modify the practice. One person told me that she would get into a long dialogue with the person, explaining the reasons that she had carried this resentment and what all her thoughts were about the incident. She was spending a lot of unnecessary time in intellectual analysis. I had to remind her that all she needed to do was to ask forgiveness for causing disharmony to the person and to the divine universe. She did not need to get into explanations. It is also interesting to observe that giving people the same instructions, how differently at times some would interpret it. One person thought that I had suggested he tell people that he was forgiving them for what they had done to him. When he came to see me one day, he was quite surprised as he told me that he was doing it faithfully, and then one night, as he was telling someone that he was forgiving them, he heard a voice in his head. The voice said, "Who are you to forgive? God forgives. You should ask for forgiveness." He found that experience quite profound and has now switched to the basic approach that had been discussed. Other people indicated as they started doing this, they would have good results, but then things would fall off. Their mind games would get in the way. They would begin to rationalize how silly this was. They were sabotaging the process, and this would provide them with the reason not to follow through. As I continued to follow up with them from time to time, they would gradually get back on track and ultimately began to experience what everyone else had reported. The forgiveness process is a simple technique. There are themes that you begin to pick up as you ask forgiveness. Some have described that associated with asking for forgiveness were issues associated with wealth or money. Others noticed that there were issues associated with abuse. Each one experiences one or more themes. Let me give a more practical example. One person described that she had come from a very poor family and that a lot of her early relationships were related to people who were better off or quite wealthy. She describes that as she began to understand and experience this, suddenly she began to see a theme or pattern where money associated with the people in her experiences had created fear. In her teenage years, she had been painfully aware that she was not worthy of money. So the relationships actually had a theme within them. Understanding this, she could release that fear about wealth. I noticed that when faces appeared randomly, if I followed these sequences with my forgiveness process, themes would appear as well. There were always an emotion such as shame, helplessness, guilt that connected with them. As I continued doing this, I realized that there were family members, my children, spouse, and others that I worried about. I realized that worrying about someone also caused disharmony in the divine universe. This also caused obstruction in their divine flow. My forgiveness then expanded to visualizing and asking for forgiveness for worrying about them. Others who are practicing this began to go through those same experiences. We all have observed that those people we were still in touch with and had asked for forgiveness, whether due to resentments or worrying about them, our relationships changed significantly and positively. Would it not be wonderful to meet and watch people around you and recognize the divinity within them? It is not only releasing, but it is so much better managing one's life with love and compassion rather than living most of the time in fear and hopelessness. Those practicing this have all said that for such a simple approach, the experience has been profound. You can join us in experiencing this. Be aware of what takes place with the sabotage and the intellect, sometimes trying to rationalize the practice away. I can tell you by using this simple practice, you will notice feeling more at peace. Now, you do not have to do it for hours at a time. I would spend about 5 minutes when I woke up and do the forgiveness technique. Some nights I could do it longer and other nights shorter. If during the day a face came up and I was busy at work, I would make a mental note to connect with that person during my practice time and ask for forgiveness of them. Choose your own convenient time. So, when do you want to start on this? Since we are all connected like drops of milk in the bucket, as we all work at this technique, we begin to create more harmony in our universe. It spreads from one person to another, and ultimately, since we are part of that divine flow, we take responsibility for it becoming more harmonious, loving, and compassionate. It not only changes us, but also our world. I hope that you benefit from attempting this experience and you receive the bounties that we have received as well.
Everyone in his or her own way just wants to be happy. The Cosmic Game.